right, so we are moving on to the 60s. So we have two lectures for this week, so make sure that you watch both. It's going to be chapters 27 and 28. So 27 is the 60s, which we'll do now. 28 is the unraveling. And after that, we should be back on track after losing that week for our course. So one of the most famous elections of the 20th century is the 1960 election, where you have the Republican candidate who, by all measures going into it, was the favorite to win. He was the current Vice President, Richard Nixon. He was a veteran politician. He was Eisenhower's vice president and vowed to continue his very popular policies. And again, he was the front runner in this election. And of course, he will eventually become president, best known for what ended up happening with the Watergate scandals, but he does not win the 1960 election in a big upset. The Democratic candidate, Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts, won. He was 43, so he is our youngest elected president, not our youngest serving president. That was Teddy Roosevelt, but Teddy Roosevelt became president through the assassination of McKinley, so technically wasn't elected president, so there's that discrepancy there. He was very famously very handsome. He was Catholic, which was very controversial at the time. People had concerns that if someone who was Catholic was president, then they would only do what the Pope said. And so there were concerns there. And again, our youngest elected president. The 1960 election is also notable for being our first election to have the first nationally televised debate. And this definitely worked in Kennedy's favor, that it was on television. Kennedy really just radiated confidence and poise. And of course, again, he's a good-looking guy. Nixon, not so much. And on top of that, he was ill, and so he appeared very tense and tired. And so this, Kennedy's performance dispelled a lot of people who had doubts about his age and lack of experience, because he came off very well. And he gave impressive, crisp, fact-filled answers. In fact, if you watch the debate, which you can find it on YouTube, is really interesting because of how different it is from debates now, and that both of them give like a lot of detail to their plans. And we're not used to that. I mean, if you watch the debates now, they're pretty surfacey, and everybody's looking for that like sound bite, right? That's gonna, their little quip that's gonna get out there and start trending in social media. And that certainly isn't going to happen when you give like long details about your plans. And so it's very different. And in fact, the people who listened to the debate on the radio thought that Nixon won, but the people who watched the debate thought that Kennedy won. So again, that gives you an indication of how much appearances mattered in this election. So it's interesting because Eisenhower at that point was then the oldest serving president we'd ever had, and he's handing off the administration to Kennedy, the youngest. And so it really seemed as though we had this like new generation. The phrase, the torch has passed to a new generation of Americans, was used. So he was a very vigorous and active president. His wife, Jackie Kennedy, of course, very famously glamorous as well. And at the time, there was a popular musical running that a lot of people had seen that portrayed the romance and adventure of King Arthur's court at Camelot, the mythical Camelot. And a lot of people saw parallels between the mythical Camelot and Kennedy and his dedicated band of advisors. And so they started referring to the Kennedy White House as Camelot. So Kennedy made a lot, again, he was a vigorous president in the time in which he was in office, did a lot of changes and implemented some new organizations. In March of 1961, we have the Peace Corps, which is, of course, still around for today, in which volunteers agreed to serve 2 to 3 years in developing nations. And this Peace Corps really shows the American concept of idealism and generosity to the rest of the world. Similar to that is the Alliance for Progress. This was focused specifically on Latin America, and it pledged to give $10 billion over 10 years as an effort to construct houses and hospitals, not simply just to, express, again, American idealism and generosity to other parts of the world, but also to thwart the expansion of communism. So if you remember back when we started talking about the Cold War, I said everything comes back to communism in terms of our foreign policy in the Cold War. And we're still in the Cold War here, the Cold War phase. And you can see again that that's, even if it's not the main reason why we do something internationally, it's still there. Unfortunately for Kennedy, very early on in his administration, he faces a crisis, and it really gets botched. So in the late 1950s, Fidel Castro in Cuba led a Cuban revolution, and initially the United States supported it. But when Castro established ties later on with the Soviet Union, our support of his revolution faded and became a source of fear, because of course any threat of communism, we feel the need to contain it. And in the course of this revolution, many Cubans fled to the United States. So the CIA came up with this effort to secretly train some of these Cuban refugees to invade Cuba, specifically at a place called the Bay of Pigs, with the intent of overthrowing the government there. So this happened, this whole organization started prior to Kennedy coming into office. But Kennedy is going to be in office when the planned invasion actually occurs. And he expressed his doubts, but decided to give the go-ahead and allow it to happen. It happened on April 17th, 1961. And the Bay of Pigs invasion was pretty famously just a nightmare. 20,000 men from the Cuban army are going to attack and defeat them. And this really damages Kennedy's international prestige. But for his part, he does take responsibility for it and reasserts the fact that the United States will resist further communist expansion around the world. But our troubles with Cuba don't end there in the Kennedy administration. It was discovered that the Soviet leader at the time, Khrushchev, was continuing to aid Cuba, and in fact had built and organized 42 missile sites in Cuba. Each site was equipped with warheads that had 20 to 30 times more power than the bombs that we had used in Japan. And they had the ability to reach the United States within 5 minutes. So our spy planes had detected the fact that these missile sites were in existence on October 14th, 1962. And in response to this obvious threat to the United States, Kennedy decided to make a blockade of the island of Cuba. And they say that if the Soviets won't remove the missiles, then the United States will launch a massive invasion of the island of Cuba with an intent to destroy them ourselves. So for a week, there was just this terrifying possibility that there might be nuclear war, and it was very real. We now, with the benefit of hindsight, of course, know that didn't happen, but they didn't know it at the time, and so it could have happened, and it was just a terrifying time for everybody in the United States. But eventually, through a series of negotiations, the missiles were agreed to be removed, and in exchange, the U.S. vowed not to invade Cuba. Okay, switching gears here to talk about some domestic issues. We started to talk about the beginning of the quote-unquote civil rights movement. But again, I emphasize this was an ongoing movement in existence prior to the time period, but this is the one everybody knows about. So when we last left off, we were talking about the start of that with the Montgomery bus boycott. So we have a new organization here, the Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE. And in May of 1961, 13 quote-unquote freedom riders decided to test this notion of bus desegregation, because again, the buses were supposed to be desegregated in the South. And a group of white supremacists decided to attack the buses in response. So clearly, there's bus desegregation in law, but not in practice. Remember, we talked about the difference between de jure and de facto segregation. So de facto segregation showing here that it's not actually occurring. And this spurs the then Attorney General, Robert Kennedy. Yes, he is John F. Kennedy's brother, probably equally as famous as him. I don't know if you've ever heard of him before, but again, he's pretty famous in his own right. He was appointed Attorney General by his brother in a pretty stunning act of nepotism, but made a very good Attorney General nonetheless. And he decided to get the Interstate Commerce Commission to ban bus segregation in reality. And this proves that direct action testing of the laws would work, and started the civil rights anthem of "We Shall Overcome." So Dr. King then decided to plan a massive demonstration in what they had determined to be the largest segregated city in America, and that is that of Birmingham. So in April of 1963, they planned this demonstration. However, the city commissioner of public safety, a man by the name of Eugene or Bull Connor, arrested 3,000 of the demonstrators. And King was put in jail. This is where he wrote his very famous letter from Birmingham jail, in which he defends his use of civil disobedience, which, remember, is not going to be something that all civil rights leaders are going to advocate. And Bull Connor went forward and decided to use clubs, police dogs, fire hoses, as you can see from the pictures depicted over there on the right, against the demonstrators. So you have a constitutional right to demonstrate and to protest. This is guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. And to see people who are peacefully protesting attacked by police dogs, fire hoses, and clubs, this was broadcast on American television, and it outraged the rest of America to see, again, people's constitutional rights very clearly being violated, and actually seeing it. Not just hearing about it, but seeing it gives a new dimension. So President Kennedy decides to call for a strong civil rights bill to start combating some of these issues. And on June 11th of 1963, he calls for racial justice. And this is a major turning point because now he's asking Congress for a bill to prohibit segregation, speed up school integration, and ban hiring discrimination. So you can see the federal government now being involved and publicly stating their support for stronger civil rights legislation. So Dr. King and others decide to organize to show support for Kennedy's bill. So again, this is something that Kennedy proposed that Congress passed, because of course Congress passes our laws. So Kennedy can issue an executive order, but a law is much more long-lasting and binding, and so that's what they want to see happen. And to gain support for that and to urge Congress to see it passed, there's the March on Washington that is organized by King and his supporters. 200,000 people, black and white, show up to hear the various speakers. Dr. King's very famous "I Have a Dream" speech is the culmination of this protest. But still, there was strong Southern opposition to any kind of stronger civil rights legislation. So by the fall of 1963, Kennedy appears to be fulfilling his promise as this new, young, vigorous leader bringing change to America. But all that ends on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas, when he is shot and killed by Lee Harvey Oswald, leading to his vice president, a man by the name of Lyndon Johnson, to be sworn in, or LBJ as everybody refers to him. A very controversial president because of his... it's going to be under his administration that we become increasingly involved in Vietnam, which we're going to talk about. But that's not all there is to his presidency. Again, he's pretty controversial. Whether or not some historians are trying to look back on his presidency to kind of get a revised view of it. This is called revisionist history, when a historian looks back and tries to revise the traditional view of a certain public figure. So that's what people are doing here, but you can draw your own conclusions based on the facts that we'll present here. And yes, I know that there's the whole controversy surrounding Kennedy's assassination. If you want to go down that rabbit hole and look more into that, be my guest. But officially, the story is he was shot by Lee Harvey Oswald and Lee Harvey Oswald alone. So that's what we're going with. Okay, so for LBJ, the civil rights movement was, in his mind, the most urgent legislation that he needed to see through Congress. So on July 2nd, 1964, he does sign into law the Civil Rights Act. Now, this is the most important piece of civil rights legislation since the Reconstruction era. It bars discrimination in public places, says that the Attorney General can bring suits to speed up school desegregation. It outlaws employment discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, or sex. And that last piece is what women are going to use to also push for their own gender equality, and we'll get more into that a little bit later on. Okay, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 makes the 15th Amendment an operative part of the Constitution, meaning it's actually going to be enforced. It ends literacy tests and other barriers to voting, because remember that the literacy tests and poll taxes, and which are outlawed by the 24th Amendment, were used to circumnavigate the 15th Amendment. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965, together with the 24th Amendment, do away with those barriers to voting, making your ability to vote a more actual reality. But Johnson didn't want to end with just these pieces of civil rights legislation. He also had a pretty dramatic social welfare program that he wanted to see through, and it's generally labeled the War on Poverty. So Johnson's dream was of creating this, he called it the Great Society, and it was his goal to end poverty and open up educational opportunities for all Americans. So yeah, that's a tall order. And he felt that the affluence of the 50s and now going into the 60s masked some pretty severe poverty in other parts of the country. And this was based on a book called The Other America, in which it showed that a fifth of American families lived in poverty. And so this, again, called LBJ, urged him to declare an unconditional war on poverty. All right, so what is his Great Society program? Well, it is a series of federal programs designed specifically to help the poor. So, for instance, it organizes 50 Job Corps camps for high school dropouts. Probably one of the more well-known ones is it started the Head Start programs to open up preschool for those who live in poverty, because, of course, preschool is not something that's mandated by states. You don't have to go, and so it costs money, and that makes it prohibitive for a lot of people. So Head Start programs are a way to open up preschool for those who might not be able to afford it. One of the programs was to secure jobs for the unemployed in the Appalachian region of the United States, which was historically a very poor area of the United States and continues to be a poor area of the United States. But it's been criticized for wasteful spending. It does reduce the number of poor by 10 million, but it continues to be a pretty controversial group of programs. So some landmark legislation passed as a result of the Great Society program. One of the focus is to improve the quality of education as a way, again, to lift people out of poverty. So the Elementary and Secondary Education Act allocated about $1 billion in federal aid to help schools purchase textbooks, and also organized the National Endowment for Arts and Humanities to support arts and federal funding for this as well. Healthcare, Medicare and Medicaid, which is health insurance for the poor and the elderly, and the Immigration Act, which abolished the quotas, which we talked about in the 1920s, which limited the amount of people from certain parts of the world that could come into the United States. So that is abolished. Which leads to our first chapter question: in what ways did the Great Society compare to the New Deal? There are definitely some similarities that you can see, but also a few differences as well. Going along with this is there are some Supreme Court reforms, so they're by way of some very famous cases. These cases were all seen through by the Chief Justice at the time, Chief Justice Earl Warren. So Baker versus Carr is the first. It says that state legislatures have to create legislative districts with roughly equal proportions. And so you may remember from your high school civics class or any other political science class that you've taken that the issue of gerrymandering, by which legislative districts, the borders of them are drawn to benefit one political party over another. So this seeks to make sure that that doesn't happen, although it still happens. Gideon versus Wainwright provides for counsel for the indigent. So if you can't afford an attorney, one will be provided for you, which you know that as your right because of the next case, and that's Miranda versus Arizona, which says that people who are arrested have to be made of their rights, particularly your right to remain silent, and your right to an attorney, which was, again, guaranteed by Gideon versus Wainwright. All right, so those are some domestic things that are going on. We're switching gears a little bit now and going to talk about the start of the most controversial foreign involvement that we are going to have at this time, and that is our involvement with Vietnam. So let's go back in history a little bit to understand how did we get involved in the Vietnam War. So Vietnam, for a while was a French colony. Vietnam and all of the Indochina Peninsula, pictured there on the map on the right, was controlled by the French. It was their colony. But during World War II, Japan invaded this French-controlled colony and controlled it pretty much for the duration of World War II. And because of this Japanese infiltration and occupation during World War II, communist forces started to infiltrate this region and to spread their political ideology. After World War II, communist forces led by the most famous communist of this region, Ho Chi Minh, declare Vietnam to be an independent country. And there's going to be a civil war fought between the French and the communist forces led by Ho Chi Minh. In 1954, the French lose, and this leads to the Geneva Accords, in which Vietnam was agreed to be divided into a communist north with a French-backed south. Now, we were supporting the French in their fight against the communist forces of Ho Chi Minh for a variety of reasons. And again, looking back on it and looking back to what this led to, it obviously seems pretty ill-advised for us to get involved. But our alliance with the French during World War II pressured us into declaring our support for them. It's more complicated than that. And I highly recommend, if you have an interest in the Vietnam War, there's an excellent documentary done by the famous documentarian Ken Burns. It's on Netflix. So if you're looking for your next binge watch and you want to get a leg up on some U.S. history things, you can go ahead and watch that. It's very good. And the first episode really gets a deep look into how our involvement started in Vietnam. All right, so Eisenhower refuses to lead Vietnam to the communists. Again, containment. That is not containment, because now North Vietnam is communist. So by default, that's not containment. There was a fear that the fall of South Vietnam to the communists would lead to a continued communist expansion in Southeast Asia, known as the domino theory. Like a line of dominoes, if one country falls, all these other countries will fall too, like a series of dominoes, and that would be bad. So the Geneva Accords called for a free election with the possibility of reunification in 1956. But instead, the United States decides to support the new government of the South, led by Ngo Dinh Diem. And the South Vietnam communists, so the communists who are living in South Vietnam, which was not communist, but there were communists living there, called the Viet Cong, decide to call for an overthrow of Diem. One of the big problems, and again, if you watch the documentary, they do a good job of going into this, is that many of the leaders of South Vietnam that the United States decided to throw their support behind were extremely corrupt. And that only further undermined our position there. But at this point in time, we're not involved on a military level. We're just showing support internationally. And as you'll see next, we are sending advisors. So under the Kennedy administration, 900 military advisors were sent to Vietnam. There's no negotiation, and there's no call to send combat troops at this point. We do increase our economic and military aid to Diem, and eventually an additional 16,000 advisors will be sent there. So again, these are advisors. They're not, as we call it, boots on the ground, so there's no combat troops there. So there's a gradual increase of our involvement in Vietnam, from showing our support to the French, to showing our support for the South Vietnamese government, to sending advisors, to sending economic and military aid. So it's a slow buildup of our involvement. So LBJ inherits a pretty dangerous situation in Vietnam from Kennedy. In 1963, there is the overthrow of Diem in the South. There are also bombings by the Viet Cong daily in South Vietnam. So LBJ was determined to meet this threat and to prove that he was not soft on communism. On August 4th, 1964, there were reports that the North Vietnamese gunboats had fired on U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. And the House approved this resolution called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution that allowed Johnson to have the power to escalate the war effort in Vietnam. And that's exactly what happens. In 1967, 500,000 American soldiers are sent to Vietnam. They are sent on search and destroy missions. They kill 200,000 enemy soldiers, resulting in a quarter of all South Vietnamese made homeless, and 16,000 American soldiers lost between 1965 and 1967 alone. So it's this escalation and our sending now combat troops into South Vietnam, which is only going to, South and North Vietnam, which is only going to increase as time goes on throughout the late 60s and early 70s. That is going to cause an outcry by the American general population. So there were two different sides that looked at it. And in fact, within the Johnson administration, there were two different sides as well. Not everybody agreed that this was a good idea, that we should be getting involved in this way. Going way back to the beginning, there were people whose opinion advisors were that this was an unwinnable war for the United States. And this eventually is going to spread to the general population as well. So hawks is the term given to people who believe that Americans are fighting a just cause in Vietnam and believe in the fear perpetrated by the domino theory. Doves are those who believe we cannot win a guerrilla war. Remember, that is the term. It's a French term meaning little war. It's a war in which it's characterized by hit and run attacks, not traditional warfare. They believed that the loss of life was too great, that bombers were destroying the South, and that the money would be better spent on the American poor instead of funding a war effort abroad. A group of people who were most vocal about not only just our involvement in Vietnam, but also the traditional way of American life are going to start this countercultural movement. So hippies are those young people who believed that love and not war was the solution to American problems. And the new alternative way of life that these hippies espoused is known as counterculture. Counterculture meaning against culture, so against the common American culture of the time. So these were largely, the hippies were children who were from, middle-class families, again, participating in their young life as in the traditional way of American life, taught to be neat in appearance, taught the value of hard work, economic success. And so to be counter to that is to reject all of that. So being counterculture meant being groovy, as they called it, wearing jeans, wearing love beads, wearing their hair long. Again, it's a rejection, not only in your outward appearance, but by the way in which you live your life of American life. And so as a result, many of them lived very famously in communes and went to outdoor music festivals such as Woodstock, in which drugs were in heavy use. So not only is there this countercultural movement going on, but there's also an escalation in Vietnam and an escalation in the fight for civil rights at home. So from 1966 to 1967, we have what's now been deemed the long, hot summers. There were race riots in 100 different cities and towns throughout the United States, the worst being in Detroit, where there were 43 people who were killed and 5,000 people left homeless by these race riots. And the source of anger from these riots were that the high hopes of the civil rights movement were not quickly fulfilled. So just because these those important pieces of legislation that we talked about earlier on in this lecture, even though those had been signed into law, just because it's a law, again, doesn't mean that it's actually going to be happening in actuality. Remember, de facto segregation is segregation that's by fact or custom, and you can't really legislate your way out of that, or at least you can't do it very easily. And so this is coming out of that frustration. And these riots call into question the concept of civil disobedience that was espoused by King and his organizations. And so you start to see some new voices emerging in the fight for civil rights. Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael want a more militant approach, which would, of course, be the opposite of civil disobedience. Malcolm X was a minister for the Nation of Islam, a group known as Black Muslims. He was eventually murdered by a rival Black Muslim. Stokely Carmichael urged Black power. He wanted to have Black-owned communities by developing Black-owned businesses and Black representatives. And so his Black Panther Party is basically the antithesis to King's nonviolent marches. So again, not everybody agreed is that agreed with that being the best approach. There's a divergence in views as time goes on, and again, people are disappointed by the lack of progress as they see it. And again, and also you can see some parallels again by some other earlier civil rights leaders that came about. So thinking about Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, and think about the parallels to Marcus Garvey, who we talked about when we talked about the 1920s. Leading to this chapter question, compare and contrast King's civil disobedience with the Black Power movement. All right, going back to Vietnam here and talking about the Tet Offensive. Okay, so on January 31st, 1968, that is the date of the Vietnamese New Year, or Tet. And on the Vietnamese New Year, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese forces together attacked over 100 cities, villages, and military bases across Vietnam. And this was a major turning point in our involvement in the Vietnam War. The U.S. is able to regain the initiative, but heavy fighting drops LBJ's credibility. And Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy are going to also launch campaign challenges. They're both Democrats, and they're going to challenge LBJ's ability to lead this country and to lead the Democratic Party. So on March 31st, 1968, Johnson makes a couple surprising moves. Number one, he rejects General Westmoreland, who at the time was in charge of U.S. troops in Vietnam. He made a request of 206,000 more troops, and that was rejected by the president. He also agreed that he was going to halt all bombing in North Vietnam and call for peace talks. And he also, very shockingly, announced that he was not going to run again for president. 3 days after this shocking announcement, there's some more shocks that are going to just shake the American nation. Dr. King was in Memphis at the time, and the next day was shot by James Earl Ray, whose motives remain unknown as to why he decided to shoot Dr. King. His death set off even more violent riots. Again, people growing increasingly frustrated with the civil rights movement, and this only makes it worse. And then just shortly thereafter, Robert Kennedy, who was running for president and really was seen as the leader for peaceful change in this country and was the hope of a lot of people for better times ahead, was shot and killed on June 5th, 1968 by an Arab nationalist by the name of Sirhan Sirhan, who opposed his support of Israel. So these series of sudden deaths, the little progress made in peace talks with North Vietnam, and the riots, the race riots, all show that this is a nation that is very much in trouble. So the idealism with which we see the 1950s and early 1960s is really crumbling. And this is going to lead to Nixon's election. So if you recall, Robert Kennedy was really the front runner for the Democratic nomination. He was assassinated, and this leads to Hubert Humphrey to become the Democratic candidate. But on top of that, Alabama Governor George Wallace decides to run as a third party, hoping to get support of the Democrats in the South. That splits the Democratic ticket, as half the not half, but some Democrats vote for Humphrey, some Democrats vote for Wallace, leaving the way for Nixon to launch this pretty incredible political comeback. He believes that most Americans are tired of hippies, the anti-war demonstration, and urban riots, and he appears to be right. He believes that he is the one who can lead the way to honorably end the war in Vietnam, and he wins the solid majority. And he does win. Now, his election is not without controversy. Surprise, surprise, it's Nixon. And he definitely did some shady and underhanded things to get himself, actually some treasonous things. And again, I urge you to watch that documentary because they actually get into it. Some of the things that he did that are pretty bad, and we unfortunately don't have the time to get into them now. But anyway, he becomes our 37th president nonetheless.